Paul Bernstein, MD, is a practicing head and neck surgeon, former chair of the Head and Neck Division of the American Cancer Society, and founder of the Kaiser Permanente Historical Society. His novels have won awards at the San Diego Book Awards and the Asiloma Writers Conference, and Dr. Bernstein has appeared as a medical expert on Good Morning America. And on today's episode of Auto Interview, it's my utmost pleasure and joy to be having on the show again Paul Bernstein today. How are you doing, Paul?
Great, Peter. Great to talk with you again. Look forward to our discussion today.
Absolutely. I'm so excited to have you on the show. Really excited. I haven't read your amazing Flash Blind.
Well, thank you. It was really fun to write, and we'll talk about it.
Yeah. So, Paul, I found your novel, Flash Blind, to be so amazing and extremely captivating. Now, tell us, what are you trying to achieve by writing the story of Jack Odin and that of his family member? Is there something particular about the story or the evil secret at the Los Alamos National Laboratory that particularly intrigued you to write Flash Blind?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. As an author, ideas for novels really come out of personal experiences, and that really applied to Flash Blind, which was no exception. It was really based on an actual patient I operated on over 100 times. And this patient had xeroderma pigmentosa, otherwise known as XP, and I removed multiple skin cancers from him. So I really empathize with the pain and challenges of patients with this rare genetic disease where the body, your own body, can't repair DNA damage from the sun. So because your body can't repair DNA damage, you get more and more skin cancers. It's interesting that Dean Koontz, another famous author, I'm sure he didn't read Flash Blind, but he wrote a whole series on XP that he called his Moonlight Bay series. And it was about a young man with XP that would go out and surf at night because he couldn't be out during the day. So it's an interesting genetic disorder that has been written about other than in Flash Blind. But speaking of the evil secrets, that you mentioned, after visiting the Los Alamos lab, which is near Santa Fe, New Mexico, I was really intrigued by the coincidence that the Human Genome Project, in other words, sequencing the human genome, our genetic code, was being done at Los Alamos, the exact same lab that developed the atomic bomb. And so that kind of blew me away. It's like, why would there be one lab in the entire United States that would not only decode our genetic material, but at the same time develop the atomic bomb? So that was really the seed that got me going on, Flash Blind, the evil secret that I wanted to look into.
Oh, that's quite amazing to know because when I particularly read the book, I was so intrigued from the very start with the story of Jake and that of his father. It really intrigued me and I was so captivated. I was like, wow, this is another amazing novel from your hands. Very intriguing.
Oh, thank you, Peter.
Yeah. Now, when Jake discovered the file containing the Atomic Energy Commission of 1968 at Ramsey's office, I was shocked by the level of reality and secret contained in the file concerning San Odin's life, who, according to the book, is nothing like a lab rat in the hands of wicked Ramsey. The shocking point was that maybe Ramsey, with its influence, had instigated the government to release radioactive plutonium in Los Alamos. Now, following this, Jake was of opinion that if the residents of Los Alamos had been exposed to abnormal level of radiation, that might explain the case of Zane's XP, xeroderma pigmentosa, and its mother's thyroid cancer. My question is, why is this a crucial theme in your book? Also, has there been a time in America where people had been exposed to radiation that terribly affects their health? Would you love to talk about that?
Yeah, yes, Peter. I mean, that's a great question and was really what was behind the reason I was so interested in writing this novel.
Wow.
I wrote Flash Blind to really let the public know that this happened. This isn't fiction. This is something that actually happened in the 1940s to the 1980s, the United States government, under the guise of national security and atomic research, conducted a series of human radiation experiments. Okay, and these are mostly done on unwitting and uninformed civilians. So these tests,
Wow.
just like in Flashpoint, range from injecting individuals with radioactive materials to exposing them to radiation, often and almost always without informed consent. And it was really to
Wow.
understand the effects of radiation on the human body. Revelations about these experiments really happened in the 1990s under President Clinton, and that led
Hmm.
to a public outcry, prompting officials, at the time to issue a lot of apologies and to really make this public with volumes of information about these experiments. And so these human radiation experiments really underscore the ethical dark corners of the Cold War. We needed to
Wow.
understand what was going to happen if we were involved with an atomic bomb, if the world was involved with an atomic war. And to
Hmm.
figure out this was the impetus behind all these experiments that our government did to understand what the effect of radiation is on the human body. So all of this, and to answer your question, all this were true experiments, and that's what
Wow.
makes Flashpoint so compelling. Is it's based on true events.
Wow. That's very amazing to know because this is one of the interesting themes that I find to be very awesome in the book and that really had me in my chair. Like, this is really amazing. Now, let's talk about some of your characters. I found the events that surround a few of them so emotional and tearful. People like Tex Odin, who battles thyroid cancer and other ailments based on the effect of a radiation exposure. Then we have the lovely Blade Trippion, whose experience nearly brought me to tears. Firstly, I love to ask you, how do you choose your characters and what makes their story so important? And also, do you feel the pains of these characters even as a writer? I would love to.
Absolutely, great question. And as you know, as a writer, the craft of writing is about creating realistic characters.
Mm.
And it's important to do that, especially in, any genre. So in the genre of thriller, medical thriller that Flashpoint is part of, I really learned how to write characters by listening and reading to some of my favorite authors like Michael Crichton. So Michael
Oh,
Crichton, we all know, wrote best-selling novels like Jurassic Park and the Andromeda Strain. And he really crafted his characters not only to be realistic, but to be professionals that brought out the themes of his novel. Okay,
mm,
so he had paleontologists, computer experts, doctors, etc., so that he could really delve into what he was trying to do with the suspense that he was creating as an author. And so I tried to do the same thing in Flashpoint, creating characters that really represented everything from atomic scientists to medical doctors to Native American healers, all
mm,
crafted in a similar way to try and make them realistic and at the same time advance the technologies, what the theme was that Flashpoint is all about. So they fit in both as realistic characters, but they also were vehicles to really take the story forward. And it's really these personal stories like, Jake, Sean, Blair, Evil, Dr. Ramsdale, as you called him, and they're all in conflict because of their different ways of looking at the science and technology
mm.
that is underscoring Flashpoint. So, we all remember as writers, and you're great at it in terms of writing and storytelling is all about conflict, conflict, and more conflict. And it was really
Absolutely.
creating these, right. So it's creating these personal characters,
Mm,
that revolve around this kind of central theme to come in to play about the unintended consequences of what happens when science runs amok, basically, which is what truly happened when our government started doing these human
wow.
radiation experiments during the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s.
Yeah,
So that's
and
where the excitement, make them real, make your characters real.
yeah.
Oh, absolutely. So as you write each character, you go, at least I do. I try to go into their not only their point of view, but what they would feel like in the interaction with them and the other characters. And I think that's key to really rely to writing realistic characters and reading it out loud to others and seeing how they
Mm,
react. Like you mentioned, you did is really something that as a writer we all do to create this sense of realism within our fictional world.
yeah, I love that. And one thing I would love to say about flashblind characterization is the fact that they keep me in suspense. Like some point I'll be like, oh my God, what is gonna happen next? That's great. Now I also love you to tell us about sperm mutation. In the beginning chapters, when Dr. Braham was trying to know more about the cause of Saint's medical condition, Graham had to ask about Saint's father medical history to know if he hadn't been exposed to radiation prior before the time of conceiving Saint and Jake. Then you later mentioned that a small exposure may cause sperm mutation that could result in Saint's disorder. First, I'd love you to tell us about sperm mutation and how realistic could an ordinary radiation result in a sperm mutation.
So that's a great question about, and it's the science that the novel is based on in terms of what causes sperm mutation and cancer mutation at the same time. And um, we have a lot of knowledge related to patients with cancer that receive radiation therapy. Okay,
Hmm.
so radiation therapy are huge doses that are given to cure cancer in patients, and we know that they create both low sperm counts and they'll even destroy the stem cells that actually produce the sperm. Okay,
Hmm.
so that happens when we radiate patients. But in the human radiation experiments that Flashblind is based on, people didn't receive those high of doses. They were exposed in different amounts of ionizing radiation. And part of the reason they did all these experiments were to determine how much radiation the human body could withstand and before it had effects that could affect things like your germ cells or sperm, and at the same
Hmm.
time, how much radiation before your body starts to develop things like thyroid cancer, like
Oh.
Sean's mother developed. And we know, so unfortunately, because of World War II and the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we have knowledge
Hmm.
of what this type of ionizing radiation can create on the human body. And so, based
Hmm.
on that, we know that if that happens while the mothers are pregnant, a lot of the children in Nagasaki and Hiroshima were born with what's called microcephaly, which are
Hmm.
really small heads. And that's what happens if, and they didn't survive. That's what happens if you're actually exposed to large
Oh.
levels while pregnant. At the same time, some of the pregnant fetuses can have damage that can be hereditary, meaning that the cells, your DNA is actually damaged, and that can produce things like Sean's XP or xeroderma pigmentosa that can go from one generation to another.
Wow.
Fortunately, from a standpoint of fortune, if you can say that about the atomic bomb, um, the majority of problems were just in the actual patient themselves. So the ionizing radiation created a lot of cancers from thyroid, breast, lung, leukemias, and other cancers that these people developed within 5, 10, and 20 years of being exposed to these high levels of
Oh.
radiation. But those were not passed on to their children. So
Hmm.
that's what we've learned in terms of what the effect of radiation is. And that was really the basis of some of the justification for the government experiments in the US on different people was to see how much the human body could withstand in terms of this amount of radiation either injected or in the air around
Hmm.
us.
Wow. That's quite amazing. And thank you so much for shedding more light on that. Really made
Oh,
for an
sure.
amazing discussion. Love it. Now, the information contained in the author's notes section of your book have me captivated. That's towards the ending pages of the book. Could you tell us more about the information in your author's notes section?
That's a great question. It really is about what we've been talking about. I wanted to clarify for the reader where truth and fiction were the same.
Mm,
And so I used my author's notes section to really talk about the fact that almost every radiation experiment that was covered and discussed in Flashblind was based on fact. And what I had done in the 1980s and 90s, all of the human radiation experiments were released under the Freedom of Information Act in the United States, allowing
wow,
anyone access to all these experiments. And so I read basically hundreds, actually thousands of pages going through experiment after experiment. And then using that knowledge, I was able to create, a novel based on fact that rang true, so to speak, to the reader, because it really happened. Even though these were things that you would think we would never do, our government did. So basically,
mm,
since the Manhattan Project, since way back in the 1940s, patients were injected with plutonium in these secret experiments, and they were done to figure out how much radiation all of these nuclear weapons workers could withstand, because we were planning on building a lot of atomic bombs, which we have.
wow,
And so we wanted to know how much the workers could withstand in terms of radiation. And then the
wow,
thing that really kind of like blows you away when you think these were government experiments were that 800 poor pregnant Caucasian women at Vanderbilt University were given radioactive iodine without their knowledge. They were actually
wow,
injected. These are pregnant women injected with a radioactive material, and that resulted in a significant cancer increase in their children. And this
wow,
was deliberately done. And
wow,
then the thing that we hear about a lot are things where we use different experiments on prisoners and mentally challenged children were both used without their consent. And basically, as you mentioned earlier, it was like Dr. Ramsdale, evil Dr. Ramsdale said in Flashblind, which was true, at that time, that all of these people were cheaper than chimpanzees. So it's a, you know, bad saying, but in reality, it was. So basically, when you look at the volumes of true experiments, and that's what the author's note was about, was to
mm,
really clarify in the reader's mind that what they're reading that sounded like fiction, sounded like something I made up, was
mm,
really reality. And as famous author Mark Twain said, truth a lot of times is stranger than fiction. And so this was all truth, and that's what
wow,
I wanted to clarify, that these actually happened. And that's the
wow,
underlying theme of Flash, but I don't want to give away what they were doing. But
mm,
back to what we were talking earlier, why why was Los Alamos the same lab where they decoded the human genome? They figured out our DNA sequences, and they developed the atomic bomb, and they did all these radiation experiments. And in my mind, there's a correlation, there's a connection between the two. And that's what the reader will learn about in Flashblind, is what is the connection that our
mm,
government was looking for between sequencing our human genes and developing the atomic bomb. And there is something that I believe the government was doing that hasn't been confirmed, and maybe will be released in another 50 years. But
wow,
at this point, when you read Flashblind, you'll read more about what that secret program was about.
wow. That's quite amazing. I love your answers to this question. God remember what I've read in Time Parks. Very
Thank
lovely.
you.
Very lovely. I love them so much. Now, since you've written this particular novel made under the genre of medical thriller, I'd love you to talk more about criticism. I'm curious to know if you've ever experienced any criticism or negative reviews of the book. If you've ever had one, how did you react to it?
So I've never had a negative review, so I wouldn't know how to answer that question. That's a joke. I've had tons of negative reviews.
Wow.
I think that the key is to read books on writing. So I really recommend that anyone listening today that is a writer and wants to improve their skill, if they haven't
Mm,
already read Stephen King's book on writing, that's something that I'd highly recommend because it's so well written, because Stephen King is such a great
Oh,
writer. But at the same time, it talks about his experience. And one of the things that is really surprising that his first novel, Carrie, which was made into a movie and was a huge bestseller,
yeah.
had 30 rejections. He sent it around to a bunch of agents and he got 30 rejections before it finally got accepted. And that shows you that even the best novel that can be a huge bestseller
Absolutely.
and an amazing movie is going to
Yeah.
get rejections. And so my advice to anyone that's writing, either starting out in writing or currently writing, is to really join a read and critique group. So join a group of writers
Mm,
that will listen and read your writing and give you honest critique. Because if you just give it to your friends and family, they'll be always say, "Oh, it's amazing! You're such a great writer,"
yeah.
but that's not real. Okay, and you really, really, really learn by taking it to read and critique groups and get some honest feedback from other writers, a
Yeah.
lot of which are more experienced than you are. So that's why I think it's good. Now, the other thing that I find really helpful is Chat GPT. So we talk a lot about AI. And so at 2 in the morning, when you're writing and you don't have your friends around or reading critique group to send off, a paragraph or a few pages to get feedback, ChatGPT really will be a great
Wow.
tool because you can put a few
Wow.
paragraphs or a few pages into ChatGPT and then ask it. And you can even say, what would Stephen King say about this page? How would he critique it?
Wow.
And it'll come back with some amazing suggestions. So it's not
Wow.
writing your book for you, of course, but it is giving you feedback when no one else is either up at night or available. And
Mm,
it's really helpful. And it actually makes writing fun when I use AI because it gives me this feedback that I find really interesting. And it'll give you feedback from the point of view of any author that you want to write because it's got the database of
yeah.
all that particular author's works. So it's really
Absolutely.
interesting, and I recommend using that highly.
That's so great to know. That's really amazing to know. And thank you so much for sharing. Now, I also love to ask you, apart from, Courage to Heal that we once talked about minutes a month ago and Flash Blind, do you have any other works you've authored or maybe currently working on?
So you can see my other works because I'm sitting right here
Yeah,
in
the
front of
background.
them. I'll
We
move
run,
away so that you can read them, the
rock
names and the
bottom.
titles. And so first of all, I recommend for anyone that hasn't heard your amazing podcast on Courage to Heal that they should hopefully go in and listen to it. I think it was really a fun and
Wow.
enjoyable podcast to do with you, Peter. And so hopefully they'll listen to that. But the other novels are, if you like Flash Blind, you'll like the other two novels. So the first of them is called Rock Bottom. This one here
Yeah.
that I'm pointing to, and it's also a medical thriller, and
Wow.
it's about real events. So it's about climate change and drought in California,
Mm.
and it's all about where a deaf son of a Mexican farm worker bioengineers this miracle plant. And so this miracle plant is something that scientists have strived for years, and that's we know photosynthesis, what that does, but can you reverse photosynthesis and actually create water? And so that's what this particular scientist is doing. And it also brings up the whole issue of genetically modified or genetically engineered
Mm.
foods and people's strong feelings, about that. As you have to mark now on foods if they've been genetically modified or engineered. And so this was all
Yeah.
about trying to genetically engineer foods that could save the world, save the planet, because it wouldn't require all of the water. So, I mean, one of the reviews on Rock Bottom that you see over here said, quote, that it was a echo thriller that cranks up your adrenaline more than a Richter 7. So
Wow.
this is, I recommend anyone that liked Flash Blind to check out Rock Bottom. Now, the other one, Rerun, is really relevant to what just happened with COVID. Okay. And
Mm.
so we found that after COVID, that a great majority, almost 50% plus of healthcare workers, including physicians, experience some degree of burnout. And that's what rerun is about. It's about a plastic surgeon, successful, head of this burn unit in Los Angeles at a major university, whose
Mm.
family has a tragic death, and then he's just totally burned out, and he moves to a remote area in the Arizona desert. It starts to fix old 1957 TVs that have tubes. And as he sits there day and night fixing these old tube TVs, he watches all these old TV reruns. One is called Father Knows Best, that was out there in the 50s
Wow.
in the United States, a very famous one. And then he had issues with his family, et cetera. And all of a sudden, these old TV reruns are coming true, and he's figuring out they're trying to tell him something that could actually save the world. And so that's where this is kind of a fun read that takes us, to a world where a physician who's burned out overcomes it and does what he can to even have a greater impact on society. And so both novels
Mm.
are, I think, fun reads. They bring up dilemmas, conflicts, ethical issues that make them not only fun to read, but also things that challenge you as the reader to understand some of the ethical issues of today. And that's
Wow.
why I think they're worth reading, not only for the entertainment value, but also for your own challenge for these issues that you hear discussed both in the media and on TV. So both novels, again, are available on Amazon. So hopefully people will check them out.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Rerun and Rock
Yeah.
Bottom.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing about that. And I left a link in the description part of this interview in case we have some
Oh, great.
readers who would
Thanks.
love to check it out directly. Now, I would also love to ask you, Paul, as a published author, what sort of advice do you have for other writers who are still struggling with publishing a book? What would you advise people in this category?
So I think just as I mentioned, with Stephen King, earlier about being able to tolerate rejections, and you asked the
Yeah.
great question for any writer. Any writer has to have a thick skin in terms of being able to accept
Mm,
feedback and being able to really accept rejection. And so when I wrote Flashblind, I thought it was pretty good, and it was a great thematic book based on what we've talked about, real history.
yeah.
So I sent it around to over 40 agents, got 40 rejections
Wow.
before a New York agent, an actual major New York agent who had amazing authors, famous authors that we've all heard of. She really liked it. And then she took me on, as an author. And unfortunately, it didn't develop what we were hoping in terms of going out to this amazing big publishing house. It went to a little tiny publishing house. But just getting an agent is really the way to go. And so before you go and self-publish your novel, I think it's always worthwhile to send it around to mainstream agents,
Mm,
okay, and see if you can get representation. Because your challenge is, why are you writing the book? If you're writing the book so that you can have a lot of people read it and know about it, you need to really go mainstream because there's 1.5 million books on Amazon now, self-published,
absolutely.
and there's really no way to differentiate unless you're going to spend, you know, thousands and thousands of dollars somehow getting a publicist,
Yeah.
somebody to do your publicity for you and get a publicist and do all that, which is really hard, and spend all of your time traveling around to conferences and
Yeah.
bookstores and et cetera. It's really hard to do that. But if you go mainstream, then there's still some help, in terms of the main publishers to get the word out on
Absolutely.
your particular novel. So that's what I'd recommend is really, take the time, try to get an agent. And if you can't, it's still fine to self-publish and then do what
Yeah.
you can to get the word out, like being on podcasts like this with you, Peter, and let people know that your books
Yeah.
exist.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for your advice. And I'm hopeful that viewers, including myself, would love to utilize it. Now, in case we have some viewers who are watching this interview and they would love to get copies of your books, on what platform is it available on for purchase?
So they're all available on Amazon. So I think that's really where you get books these days. I mean, obviously, if you go to Barnes and Noble, it'll be available on there. internet website too, but mainly almost every book today is on Amazon. So that's the simplest and easiest place to get it.
Yeah. And I left a link in the description part of this interview where interested viewers can get a copy of Paul Bernstein's books directly on Amazon. So
Right.
thank you so much, Paul, for accepting the invitation to be featured on P English Literature. It's awesome having you back on the show.
Well, great. It's great to be here, Peter. I just wanted to mention one last thing that for people, there was the blockbuster movie on Oppenheimer this
Oh,
summer. That was a huge hit. I don't know if you saw it where you are, but there was a huge hit called Oppenheimer on the Manhattan Project that really links completely with what Flashblind is about. So if
wow.
you enjoyed Oppenheimer, the movie, which was a big hit in America, I
Wow.
encourage everyone to go ahead and check out on Amazon, like you just mentioned, Flashblind. And again,
That's
thank you so much because, for doing these. You really help a lot of writers like myself, and we really appreciate, all that you do for us in terms of organizing these podcasts and doing all you do to help us all as writers. So we appreciate that,
yeah.
Peter.
You're welcome. Thank you for your kind words. Thank you so much.